Hello, hope everybody's doing well. I want to thank everybody for coming out today. We are going to try to talk about North Carolinians at the Battle of Gettysburg. We want to try to kind of give you a preview of some of the holdings we have here at the State Archives of North Carolina, dealing with what records we have that have been transferred to us or we have received as gifts over the years. So we're going to kind of discuss that a little bit. But first of all, I want to kind of give you a overview of why there was a second Northern invasion in 1863. The second Northern invasion came as a response to the Confederate victory at Chancellorsville in May of 1863. Confederate General Robert E. Lee was faced with a number of options to events that were happening outside of his theater of operations. First of all, General Lee was pressured by President Jefferson Davis to provide assistance to Confederate forces fighting to defend Vicksburg, Mississippi, and Port Hudson, Louisiana during this time. If you can imagine in your mind's eye that this is Virginia, here's Gettysburg is up here. Over here somewhere, if you think about this is actually the Mississippi River up here. Vicksburg is up here, Port Hudson's down here at the bottom. So if you can imagine during this time, even though victories were being won in Virginia theater of operations, there was really things were not going that well for the Confederacy in the Mississippi and Tennessee theater, otherwise known as the Western Theater of the American Civil War. President Davis was being lobbied by what's known as the Western Theater Bloc, or the Western Bloc. These are Confederate senators and representatives from Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee to do something about the federal forces who are trying to wrestle control of the Mississippi River, which is kind of like over here somewhere. One of the pressures that was put on Confederate General Robert E. Lee was after winning the victory at Chancellorsville, which is in Virginia, which is right around this area near Culpeper, Virginia, in this particular area here, he has been basically lobbied to divide his army up, to send forces to Mississippi to help defeat the federal forces trying to take control of the Mississippi River. So what Lee was wanting to do, one of the things he was trying to prevent from happening was have his army divided up. Now, interesting enough, we won't go to it in this particular presentation, but after the Gettysburg campaign, after the Bristow Station, of course, close to Bristow Station campaign in September of 1863, Lee was ordered to send Longstreet's Corps to Tennessee to aid the Army of Tennessee to fight the Union forces in Tennessee. So that actually did happen. But at this time, he was trying to prevent that from happening. So what his solution was, very simply, was to invade the North again, very much similar to his campaign in September of 1862, to try to force the United States to pull troops from that area in Mississippi and Louisiana, to try to get those troops pulled from there, over here to try to defend Washington, D.C., which is right here. So his whole idea was, if I go up north, this is going to force the United States to send troops back to the east to pull troops away from those Confederate efforts to try to take the Mississippi River. Now, one of the things that Lee also tried to do is this kind of goes on with the concept that is in the particular work named as Lee Considered by Allen T. Nolan, which is the idea that Lee attempted to try to end the war quickly in 62 and 63 because he knew that the Confederacy could not last a war that lasted for 4 to 5 years. So his idea was, if I can get a quick victory, make the North sue for peace, then the Confederacy could survive, because the Confederacy did not have the resources for a long, proactive war. July 1st, 1863. Southern Pennsylvania soon became a scene of two major field armies trying to find each other. It's a situation where the Confederate Army was operating without its cavalry units, which is basically the Cavalry Corps under Major General Jeb Stuart. So they're basically trying to fill for the Union Army and trying to figure out where the Union Army is at. The Union Army is trying to figure out where the Confederate Army is at. You can imagine this is the Confederate forces now in southern Pennsylvania, which is no Confederate forces come this far north before. So you can imagine the politicians in Pennsylvania, Maryland, New York, areas like that are really kind of getting freaked out because now we're dealing with the Confederate forces that close to our home. Confederate Major General Henry Heath, and some of those may know about Henry Heath, he actually was a part of our earlier presentation dealing with the Sherman Laurel massacre in Madison County, North Carolina. Major General Henry Heath was ordered to move his division towards York, Pennsylvania, and to threaten a railroad going to Harrisonburg, but he had to go through Gettysburg first to follow orders. So basically what his idea was, I'm going to move through this little town, going to move on to the Susquehanna River and threaten the railroad going to Harrisonburg. Interesting enough, while he was doing this, and some of y'all may be familiar with the movie that came out several years ago, he stumbled into the Union cavalry under the command of Major General John Beaufort, which is one of the best cavalry commanders in the Cavalry Corps of the Army of the Potomac. So roughly by 11 a.m. to 12 noon, he came embroiled in heavy combat with 1st Division, 1st Army Corps of the Army of the Potomac. Now this photograph you see here, this is actually a photograph of the Chambersburg Pike. If you was in John Beaufort's Union cavalry, this is the view you would have had, looking down the road towards the Confederate forces coming at you. Major General Henry Heath's division will be coming down this road here, and your job, basically as Union cavalry, is to make him slow down, because you can see how wide a road this is. So if you got, let's say, a regiment that's like 4 deep, 4 abreast, and so far deep, you can actually make some time on this road. But if you see the sides over here with the fences on both sides, if you force him to deploy, he's going to have to deploy over those fences and get past those fences, which will take time, which will slow him down and allow the Union infantry to come up. Within Heath's division, this is the initial division that's coming down the Chambersburg Pike, which is here, is the 55th North Carolina was a part of the Brigadier General Joseph Davis's brigade that was in Heath's division. Now, Heath's infantry division that was in 3rd Army Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia was a new brigade. This is a brigade that was assigned to President Jefferson Davis's older brother, who was Joseph Davis. If some of y'all know the biography of Davis growing up, Joseph Davis really took care of Jefferson Davis when he was growing up after the death of their parents. So Joseph Davis kind of got his own brigade command to serve in the Confederate Army. So this is a new brigade that didn't have a lot of experience to it, and the 55th North Carolina was assigned to it. After the initial counterattack of the Iron Brigade, as you can see in this particular area here, remember McPherson Farm and McPherson Woods here, the 55th North Carolina was attempted to turn the Federal Union right flank to unhinge the Federal line here. As you can see the railroad cut here. The 55th came around here to turn the Union line to try to get this to proceed forward down the road towards Gettysburg. As a response, the commander of the Iron Brigade, Brigadier General Simon Meredith, who, interesting enough, was a native of Guilford County, North Carolina. He had moved to Indiana and became a Quaker and then became a brigadier general in the Union Army. He sent the 6th Wisconsin Volunteers and his brigade guard this way to attack the Confederate forces coming around the right flank of his line there. Their fire on the left of the 55th North Carolina and Davis's brigade forced the Confederates into what's known as a railroad cut. And you can see that at the top of this map here. Soon, the majority of the brigade had to surrender because they were being cut off in their own units and being pinned down by fire by Union soldiers from the banks of the cut. Here's a photograph of the railroad cut here. As you can tell, this is the bed of the railroad here. The Confederate troops had initially moved into here when they first got fired upon, because what's your first reaction if someone's shooting at you? You go hide so you don't get shot. So what they did was they thought this is a good place to go hide and get away from the musketry being fired upon them by the Iron Brigade. Unfortunately, once you get in here, if the enemy finds that you're in here, they can actually pin you down in this railroad cut. So what the Federal troops did, they actually lined along the tops of the cut and was firing into the Confederate troops in the railroad cut. And as you can imagine, they suffered an extreme amount of casualties, and eventually the guys that said, that's it, we surrender. And large numbers of the Davis's brigade surrendered at this time. Interesting enough, in 1996, they had a lot of rain on the Gettysburg National Military Park, and it washed out the bed of this railroad here, and believe it or not, they found a body that was still laying in the cut after all these years. And unfortunately, because of the equipment that's on him, it's hard to tell if a body is a Union soldier or a Confederate soldier, because Confederate soldiers will have picked up Union equipment as a part of the try to make up for supplies they were not getting from the Confederate government. So you really couldn't tell if it was Union or Confederate. So they ended up burying the body in the Soldiers' National Cemetery at Gettysburg, as an unknown soldier at the time. Now, one of the things I want to highlight, we want to talk about some of the holdings of the State Archives of North Carolina. This is a part of a recent blog post that was done by Tiffany Mazurek with our Archives Civil War 150 Committee of Reminiscences of the Battle of Gettysburg. This is done by Jeremiah Morrison, who is of Company C, 55th North Carolina, talking about being wounded on that first day of the Battle of Gettysburg. Interesting enough, you see right here it says, I was at Gettysburg and it talks about being wounded at the time. Interesting enough, he was not captured during the engagement, even though large numbers of the 55th North Carolina was. So this is actually part of our digital collection holdings that we have online with the State Archives. So at this time, kind of like a stalemate was occurring with Heath's division along the Chambersburg Pike. Now, north of the town, northwest of town, Confederate General Richard Iwell's corps was coming in from the north and from the west. And as you can tell here, his job when he first came towards Gettysburg is to unhinge the Federal line that's now facing General Heath, because the whole idea is they want to get to town, they want to grab hold of this road network here, which is going to enable them to be able to move to other points within Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, Heath was not making a lot of progress, so now they try to assign another task to another Confederate division to assist General Heath. So they sent Rose's division of Lieutenant General Richard Iwell's corps to unhinge that line. Now, the 1st Brigade that went in, there was 3 North Carolina brigades that was in Rose's division. There was Iverson's brigade, there was Ramseur's brigades, and there was Daniel's brigade. The initial attack was done by Iverson here. Now, this was not led by a North Carolinian. This was actually led by a Georgian, Brigadier General Alfred Iverson, who sent his brigade into nearly a headlong assault against Baxter's brigade here from Robinson's division at this point in the line. When they advanced, believe it or not, even though most generals try to stay with their troops, Iverson actually was not there with his troops when he advanced. He was somewhere in the back. Some claimed he was drinking. He was drunk at the time. It's hard to know, but when they advanced, the Federals came up, fired a volley, and nearly 500 North Carolinians were hit at the same time, and they fell, quote, as a line as straight as a dress parade. So you can imagine initial fire upon somebody moving in 2 lines of battle. They all fell at the same time, and the brigade just routed at that time. Matter of fact, there's some stories we're talking about that a lot of the men who did survive this initial volley laid on the ground and took out white pieces of cloth and was waving it to try to surrender to the Federals so they wouldn't get shot at anymore. Interesting enough, Iverson had a mental breakdown after this point. He literally just fell apart. We don't know if it's because of the drinking, the effect of the alcohol on him, or he was just not mentally stable enough to handle what happened. But interesting enough, he never served in active field of command after that for the rest of the war. And some blame this particular event for that. A lot of North Carolinians blame him because he's from Georgia. So in his mind, if he sacrificed North Carolinians, it's okay because they're not Georgians. So there's a lot of controversy dealing with that. Interesting enough, if y'all are familiar with the Gettysburg discussion group, there's always a joke going on that there's ghosts going around up here. There's actually trenches up here. And then if you go to certain points at night, you can see ghosts over here. So I don't know if that's true. I've not seen any ghosts, but they said they've got photographs. I guess you see the orbs, floating around in the middle of the night in this particular area here. So as a result, the 2 other North Carolina brigades were assigned to the task of trying to turn this line here, try to get this line moved out. So Daniel's brigade attacked in this direction here. You can see where the red arrow is here. And Ramseur's brigade is over here, and its job was to come around this side and turn that Federal line there. Unfortunately, it took Daniel's brigade at least 3 assaults to break this line. If you look at this photograph up here from the Gettysburg National Military Park, I'm sorry for the quality of it. I wanted to cut out the big, there's a big observation platform that's right here, so I wanted to cut it off so you guys can kind of see what it looked like during the engagement. This is a post-war photograph of what's known as Oak Ridge. This is what Daniel's men would have had to charge against to try to turn that line right there. After about the 3rd assault, they was able to turn that line. What happened was all the Confederate forces started moving at that time, and as you can imagine, they actually started to coordinate their advances at that point. So Daniel and Ramseur was able to actually unhinge this line and move towards Gettysburg, and then it was basically It depends on who you talk to. It's either a Union route through Gettysburg or it's a Union retreat through Gettysburg. It just depends on who you're talking to at the time. If you talk to Union veterans after the battle, they said they retreated through. If you talk to the Confederates, they ran through. So it depends on who you're talking to at the time on that. Now, after talking about Rose's division attacking towards Gettysburg, now it's time for Heath to redouble his efforts to try to take Gettysburg from going down the Jamesburg Pike. So now Heath was ordered to advance his entire division towards the McPherson Woods, or it's also known as the Hewitt's Woods, which is this section of trees. Can y'all see this over here? This section of trees through here. This is either known as McPherson Woods or Hewitt's Woods, because that's the Hewitt's farm that's right over here. So it's depending on what person you talk to at the time. So his job was to advance forward, take McPherson's Woods, and then take Seminary Ridge, which is basically through here. So he's now going to move his entire division moving forward. Now this time, he brought up his entire division, and one of his brigades was Pettigrew's brigade, which is the largest brigade in this division. And interesting enough, the central point of the advance was the 26th North Carolina troops, which was the largest regiment in that brigade. It was the 843 men in that brigade of a division, a brigade of 2,500 men. So it's a pretty substantial unit that's advancing towards Seminary Ridge. Now, if you look at the map that's down here, the 26th North Carolina basically started right in roughly this area here, and they're going to move from right to left across this wheat field towards, this is Willoughby Run right here. And this is McPherson Woods and Hewitt's Woods right through here. So they're basically going to start from here, and they're going to advance across this wheat field towards the creek here now. Now, one thing I want to tell y'all, when y'all see this creek here, it looks like it's pretty high, don't it? It's pretty wide. Can you kind of see in the photograph how you can actually see the run of the creek right here? In the post-war photographs of Gettysburg, the farmers had actually dammed this creek up to try to get more water for their crops. So at the time of the battle, it was a deep ravine, a small creek with a big deep ravine, very much similar to the railroad cut we saw a little bit earlier. Now, the Iron Brigade that also had fought against Heath's division previous that morning was also defending this area too. As you can imagine, they had always suffered substantial losses, and they're actually trying to defend this area right here, as you can see through here on the map. Now, interesting enough, when Pettigrew's men moved across the wheat field, you can tell this is a brigade that didn't have a lot of combat experience. So what they did was, when they started moving out, especially the 26th North Carolina, they ordered their color guard to move forward of their regiment to lead the advance across the wheat field. Now, in drill purposes, that's a great idea. It gives you, a flag was used to basically pinpoint where the regiment was. It's like a big place marker, like a big Post-it note, as you will. So the color guard was ahead of the 26th North Carolina. And actual combat experience and actual combat tactics on the field, that's like, please shoot me because I'm in the front with a big flag in my hand. So as you can imagine, the color guard of the 26th North Carolina started taking casualties as soon as they started moving across this wheat field here, because the unit that they were facing was not a 6-month regiment or a newly raised Union militia unit. This is the Iron Brigade of the 1st Division, 1st Army Corps of the Army of the Potomac. These guys have seen combat since 7 days. So basically, they're like combat veterans at this time. So basically with them, it's like, let me sight my musket in and see how many guys I can hit going across the wheat field. So as you can imagine, the 26th North Carolina was taking heavy casualties moving across this wheat field towards the run itself. After advancing to the wheat field, the 26th North Carolina plunged into the banks of the Willoughby Run. We talked about that before. It's a deep ravine with briars and everything else. So you can imagine, here you are running with a 9-pound musket. You're carrying equipment on your back. You've already been shot at. Now you got to go down this ravine and climb back up the other side as well, as the whole time getting fired at by Union soldiers too as well. If you see this photograph down here at the bottom, it's hard to see. This is Willoughby Run here. This is the monument to the 19th Indiana, which is here. So the monument's kind of like right here. So the 26th will have been over in this area here, as you can tell with this map here. This is Willoughby Run. There's the 26th. There's the 19th Indiana. There's the 24th Michigan there, who end up doing most of the fighting against the 26th. Now, once climbing out of the ravine, the 26th North Carolina advanced into a stand-up firefight with the 24th Michigan Volunteers with the Iron Brigade. Now, this is interesting because for the 24th Michigan, this is their first engagement as well. This is their first major engagement as well as the 26th. So what they did was they basically got in what's known as, now some of y'all who may be familiar with the Second Manassas Campaign, you ever heard of the Battle of Groverton? Battle of Groverton was a stand-up firefight between the Stonewall Brigade and the Iron Brigade. Basically what they did was they got within 500 yards of each other and basically just stood there and fired volleys at each other. Nobody was ducking. Nobody was hiding behind a tree. Everybody was basically standing up and blazing away at each other. This is the same thing that happened here too as well. The inexperience of both regiments came into play at this time. As you imagine, in 64, 65, they do what they describe as Indian fighting, which is from tree to tree, from stump to stump, because you don't want to get shot. You want to hide and shoot somebody else. In this case, they have a sense of honor, so they're going to stand up and basically fist it out with muskets and stand-up firefight. So with the assistance with other Confederate units advancing here and through this area. Now, if you can imagine Daniels, we just got to talking about Daniels. Daniels is over here somewhere. He's actually coming in this direction, so you can tell the Union lines becoming unhinged. So Pettigrew's brigade was able to push the Iron Brigade back. Part of it was the severe losses that the Iron Brigade had from that morning, as well as the severe fire going on, and their flanks were being turned at the time. Now, the commander of the 26th North Carolina was Harry King Berggren Jr. He was basically the boy colonel of the Confederacy. He was about 21 years old when he received command of the 26th North Carolina, which is kind of rare if you think about it, because at the beginning of the war, they tried to move regimental commands towards either West Point officers or somebody who had some kind of military training. Well, Henry Bergman Jr., he recently graduated from VMI, from Virginia Military Institute, and they say that he received a recommendation from General Stonewall Jackson to take command of the 26th North Carolina against the wishes were of his then brigade commander, who was General Ransom at the time. So Bergman was leading the 26th across this area. Now, things were pretty bad for the 26th at this time. They had lost 4 color bearers just crossing the creek itself. And then when they started to make this advance towards the 24th Michigan, they were losing a lot of color bearers at this time. Now, there's some stories on how Bergman got shot. If you see, there's a painting out there of Bergman holding a sword and leading his men forward, holding a flag. That's one way that they talked about he might have got shot while he was leading his unit. Most of the accounts I've read said basically they was losing color bearers at a high rate, and it was trying to keep the Confederate regimental banner up and moving forward. Many ways to motivate their men to charge. Also, too, to mark where the regiment was, because if you think about it, this is the center of the line. And if you know anything about anything about Civil War military tactics, especially brigade advances, when a regiment is the center of the line, their flag has to be the highest, because they have to be able to turn to your right and say, all right, that's where I need to be, because that's where the flag's at. I'm looking at the flag to try to focus where I need to keep my men at that time and find another regiment. So what happened was color bearers were dropping left and right. One color bearer was shot. He fell down. Bergman picked up the flag. Now, once Bergman picked up the flag, he realized he made a mistake. One, he's going to get shot. That's probably one big mistake there. Two, he's a regimental commander. His job is to coordinate the advance of this regiment right here. As trying to coordinate the advance, he cannot be holding the flag. His job is to be giving orders to company commanders to his left and to his right. So trying to hold the flag and do this at the same time will not work. And he realized that. So what he did was he went to one of the company commanders and said, do you have a private I can give this to, so I can get back to what I'm supposed to be doing, which is I'm a regimental commander. They found a private to give it to. They gave it to the private. The private took the flag, and right when Bergman turned to the left to talk to someone, he was shot in his side 2 times by the Federals facing the regiment. And unfortunately, the private who took the flag, he was initially killed with a shot to the head as soon as he took the flag out of his hand. Soon after that, the lieutenant colonel of the regiment James Lane took the flag. He was in the process of turning around to his men saying, let's charge these Yankees or whatever, and he was shot in the back of the head, and he, believe it or not, he actually lived. The bullet actually went through his back of his neck and went through his jaw and his front teeth and going back out again. So Bergman was shot. It seemed to be a fatal wound. They talked about the fact that he was losing breathing, and he also bled to death while he was laying on the field, because at that time a lot of combat's going on. You can't really attend to all the wounded at that time. Here is a photo. Here's a painting of Colonel Bergman here. This is from the Virginia Military Institute. This is the monument where Bergman was shot at for the 26th North Carolina. Believe it or not, this monument was put up in 1985 by the Department of Cultural Resources and the North Carolina Historical Commission to commemorate this particular part. If you look down, you see it's on the top of the, see how far down that's going right there? That kind of gives you the idea of what they had to face coming up the hill, going towards the 24th Michigan, right in this particular area here. The 26th North Carolina suffered 687 casualties out of 843 men. Company F had 91 officers and men, 31 was killed and 60 was wounded. So basically that company was basically taken out of service for the rest of the engagement. The 24th Michigan suffered 363 casualties out of 496 men. The 24th Michigan suffered basically a 73% casualty rating at this time. Both regiments lost more men in all the regiments in the respective armies during this particular campaign. One thing you want to look for when you go to our digital collections and our Archive Civil War 150 Committee blog site that we have, we've been kind of tracing the life of Henry King Bergman Jr.'s brother, who is William Bergman. Some of the letters we have here at the State Archives, and one of the letters that we have is him finding out that his brother was killed at Gettysburg and finding out from his family about that.
July 2nd, 1863. After an exhausting day of July 1st, July 2nd dawned early, and by 7 o'clock a.m. it was already 74 degrees. The day promised to be a very hot one. Confederate troops were somewhat confident, but I'm going to concentrate primarily on what the 6th North Carolina State troops were doing that day, because I think they epitomize the state's participation in this particular historic battle. It's important for us, I think, to get a sense of an overall sense of Gettysburg, and it's because it seems to me that much of this battle dealt with the varying terrains that are found around Gettysburg, and this map shows an overall view of that. This is Gettysburg right here, but you can see all along here the different types of terrain that are in the particular area. There were fields, there were forests, rolling hills and ridges, rocky areas, and swollen streams, because many of the streams in the area, there had been a lot of rain, and there were actually some swollen streams in the area. These terrains had a big effect on the timing as well as the outcome, I think, of some of the battle as well. And this closer map really shows you an area that was occupied on the second day. Bill was talking about this area up in here. The second day's battle is down in this area, which a lot of times you'll hear people talk about it being a fish hook. This particular area right in here is where most of the fighting for the second day occurred that involved North Carolinians. There were certainly other things going on, but we're concentrating on North Carolinians. Even closer now, we see the area around Cemetery Ridge, which is where we're going to be. This is Cemetery Ridge right here. This over here is Culp's Hill. Culp's Hill and Cemetery Ridge are where most of the North Carolinians were in the fighting on the second day. Most of the early part of that day was spent with both armies trying to maneuver themselves into the best position they could find. And it was really not until about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, in the 90-degree heat, that the attack actually began. That most of the day for the Confederates had been spent trying to avoid the bullets of sharpshooters that were working on them. And this had gone a long way towards increasing the anxiety as well as the tension of what is going on, because there were sharpshooters placed everywhere and were really doing a number on the Confederates. This particular photograph here is a photograph from Cemetery Ridge looking back towards Gettysburg. And the reason I wanted to show you this is because it gives you a feel for the elevation of Cemetery Ridge. We're not talking about mountains here. We're talking about hills and ridges. Now, this is a person right here, so you can get a feel for how high we are on Cemetery Ridge. This is a drawing from Cemetery Ridge looking back towards Culp's Hill. Culp's Hill is right here, and this is Cemetery Ridge. The 6th North Carolina state troops were supposed to be coming this way up to and to take Cemetery Ridge, was their objective. This particular photograph is not identified, but I do believe that it is Cemetery Ridge, and it shows, this will give you a feel for the rise that the troops have to come across in order to get up to the ridge. And like Bill was showing you, there's fields down here, then there's a ravine here, and they've got to come up to the ridge. So you can see the difficulty of the area. One other thing I think that you notice well in this particular photograph is how rocky and uneven the area is around Cemetery Ridge. And as I said, there were troops fighting, North Carolinians fighting at Culp's Hill, at Cemetery Hill, and on Cemetery Ridge. So all along this little area right in here, there were North Carolinians involved in battle. The 6th North Carolina was among the North Carolina troops that were ordered to take the two hills, Culp's and Cemetery. They were commanded, the 6th was commanded by Colonel Isaac E. Avery after the wounding of Major General Robert Hoke. And the 6th Regiment, unlike the regiment that Bill was talking about, was a regiment of veterans. These men had seen real action from Manassas on, so they were seasoned veterans in terms of fighting. This is Colonel Isaac Avery, and he was born to a highly civic-minded planter family in Burke County, North Carolina. He was born in 1828. He spent a year at UNC, but left after a year in order to work on one of the family's farms. And he served as the captain for the 6th North Carolina State Troops. He was wounded at 1st Manassas fairly seriously, and again at Gaines Mill. It was a minor wound at Gaines Mill. Colonel William Dorsey Pender really thought enough about Colonel Isaac Avery that he recommended him for a lieutenant colonel, and then a few days later he became an actual colonel. He was very, very well respected by his men, and he was known to be a man of great integrity and judgment. Avery was a very large man. He was over 200 pounds and very powerfully built. At Gettysburg, he was also mounted on a white horse. He was 34 years old and became acting brigade commander when Hope was wounded at Chancellorsville. This is not overly clear, but this is again the fighting at Cemetery Ridge. The day before, the 6th North Carolina had been fighting on flat terrain, but today they're fighting on very hilly and uneven terrain. At first, Avery had decided not to use his horse because of the unevenness of the terrain, but he changed his mind. He was now one of the only mounted men on the field. And it was dusk before they actually got into position, and at dusk, Colonel Isaac Avery and Brigadier General Harry Hayes and his Louisiana Tigers charged across Culp's Farm and struck the Union forces at the base of East Cemetery Hill. This area right in here, this is Cemetery Ridge again up here, and they're coming from this direction. They're coming across the farmland up into this area here. It was almost dark, and the Union artillerymen sent out a hail of canister and shrapnel. They probably were shooting at just what was a very dark or indistinct mass of people coming at them. And many, many, many people fell in the crops and on the uneven terrain. One of the wounded who fell was Colonel Isaac Avery. This is Cemetery Ridge. This is Cemetery Ridge today. There were fences here, and a lot of the Union forces were behind these fences, so they had cover, unlike what was happening with the 6th North Carolina. Colonel Isaac Avery was hit in the neck and shoulder and paralyzed on his right side. He fell alone, and it was some time before anyone knew that he had fallen at all. He was able to get a pen and pencil out of his pocket, and he wrote a message to his father, Isaac Thomas Avery. And you've seen that, most of you have seen this picture many times because we trot it out every chance we get. And that this is what we call the message from the dead, and it says, "Major, tell my father that I died with my face to the enemy," and he signed it I.E. Avery. He had this on his person, holding it in his hand. Sometimes you hear he was holding it in his hand when he was actually found. He was found by his men. He lingered through the night and for a total of 30 hours and didn't die until just after dark on July 3rd. Captain John A. McPherson remained with him until he died. He and Major Samuel McDowell Tate were the two that took turns watching over him as he lay dying. And the major that he is talking about in his note is Tate. But McPherson was with him actually at the moment when he died. There were hospital wagons or ambulances at the rear of the fighting, and McPherson had to really hustle after Avery died to get a box built in order to transport Avery's body. They knew that the hospital wagons were going to start to retreat soon, and he needed to get his remains on board. And according to a letter that we have copies of at the archives, he wrote a letter. In this letter, he wrote to Avery's father. He went to a mill and he got some walnut lumber, and he had a coffin very hastily built to put the remains in. The hospital wagons left Gettysburg on July 5th, and they were attacked on the evening of July 6th. About 300 wagons were actually destroyed by Federal cavalry. It was not until the 13th that the 6th North Carolina made it to Williamsport, Maryland. According to a contemporary account, a contingent of North Carolina soldiers arrived at the Potomac River to find Elijah, Avery's body servant, defending the coffin from some Georgia soldiers who wanted to throw it in the Potomac River because, as you might imagine, with 90-degree plus heat for days and days and days, that things were somewhat unpleasant. North Carolina soldiers did reinforce Elijah's defense of the coffin, but they did have to bury it there in Williamsport, Maryland. The grave was probably marked with just a piece of crudely engraved wood. That's what they were doing when they had to bury people in the field at that time. And it is believed that Avery's body was, along with other Confederates that had been buried in that area, were later moved to the Washington Confederate Cemetery in Hagerstown, Maryland. In the late 1870s and 80s, there was a concerted effort to made to get all of the remains that were scattered all over the place in one place and move them to that Confederate cemetery. There's a monument there that actually has information about some of the men. They weren't buried in exactly a mass grave, but there was a mass number of graves there that were somewhat hastily marked. And according to the information that's on the monument that is there is no Isaac Avery listed there. There is, however, a Colonel J.E. Ayers listed as being buried there. And they list him as being part of the 6th North Carolina State Troops, which had no Colonel J.E. Ayers, but did have a Colonel I.E. Avery. Circumstantial evidence sort of at this point seems to indicate that J.E. Ayers is indeed I.E. Avery. The rhetoric that exists, this is a picture here of the letter that McPherson wrote to Avery's father. And the rhetoric that exists that's related to the death of this man is absolutely incredible. There is actually quite a lot written about his death. And even given the passage of 150 years and allowing for the flowery writing style that was really common during Victorian times, Avery must have been a monumental man and soldier, because he was certainly well thought of by scores and scores of people who felt it incumbent upon them to say something about his death. He appeared in newspapers very quickly after his death that he had died, and a lot of people really, very clearly loved him and felt his loss quite a lot. And I think probably that is a fitting end to the second day with the loss of Isaac Avery, and not only with the loss of Isaac Avery, but with the loss of a tremendous number of men and a whole lot of promise.
The events that occurred on July 3rd, 1863 at the Battle of Gettysburg are well known to most people and annuals of history as Pickett's Charge. But many casual followers of that day are only aware of the charge made by George Pickett and his division of Virginia troops, and they are not particularly familiar with the thousands of North Carolinians, Tennesseans, Mississippians, and Alabamians led into battle on Pickett's left. In fact, North Carolinians alone made up roughly a third of the attacking Confederate forces, and suffered losses comparable in proportion to those of Pickett's Virginians. Now, North Carolinian veterans of the battle fought for years to make their accomplishments known, and claimed that their high water mark, or the point of farthest advance, surpassed that of Pickett's Virginians. Now, while it has never been definitively proven one way or the other whose men made it the farthest, North Carolinians have at least been recognized by modern-day scholars as equal contributors to the attack. Now, such views have been reflected in recent nomenclature of the charge, with many authors now referring to the charge as the Pickett-Pettigrew Trimble Charge instead of just Pickett's Charge, in honor of the other two division commanders who participated in the assault. Now, these two division commanders, James Johnston Pettigrew and Isaac Ridgway Trimble, were both leading divisions for the first time in combat when they were called upon to participate with Pickett's division in the famous charge. Now, in fact, neither had even commanded their respective divisions at the beginning of the battle, and had only succeeded to their commands by virtue of attrition from the first day of battle. Now, Pettigrew was a native North Carolinian and a graduate of UNC Chapel Hill, where, interestingly enough, he somehow managed to achieve perfect grades all 4 years of his attending that university. He led his brigade through heavy combat during the first day of battle, which Bill already covered. Now, it was probably a poor decision on Lee's part to even suggest that the division participate in the assault with Pickett, as they had suffered terribly during the first day of fighting. Now, as Pettigrew had succeeded to command of the division, James K. Marshall, who is a graduate of VMI and a native Virginian, but who had fought with North Carolina troops throughout the war, would now lead Pettigrew's old command of Tarheels in the charge. Now, Pettigrew's other brigades consisted of a brigade of Virginians, a mixed unit of Tennesseans and Alabamians, and a brigade consisting of 3 Mississippi regiments and a single North Carolina regiment, which would be Joseph Davis's brigade, which Bill also already covered. Now, all 3 of these brigades had also seen considerable action on the first day of battle. Now, Isaac Trimble, seen here on the right, would lead half of his division in support of Pettigrew's attack. It consisted of 2 brigades made up entirely of North Carolina troops, one of which had also suffered heavy losses on the first day. Now, of the 27 regiments which made up Pettigrew's and Trimble's attacking forces, 15 were all North Carolinian regiments. Now, this is a map of the plan for Pettigrew and Trimble's attack, in addition to Pickett's attack. The plan was for Pettigrew to advance straight ahead with Trimble in support, as Pickett's division advanced at an angle to link up with Pettigrew's right. Now, a small grove of trees indicated here on the map would serve as an unofficial guide point for both divisions. Pettigrew would advance keeping his right to the left of the trees, while Pickett would advance and attempt to stay to the right of the clump of trees. Now, note also the road running at an angle through the division's line of march. This is the Emmitsburg Road, and it would prove to be a formidable obstacle to the attackers, especially to Pettigrew's and Trimble's men. Pettigrew's men traversed a mile of open ground, all the while exposed to artillery and rifle fire. Now, because Pettigrew's units had been so decimated on the first day of battle, their ranks were closely packed and their battle flags clumped tightly together, which made easy targets for the skilled Union artillerymen. Now, this photo is a post-war view of the ground over which Pickett's men advanced. Now, the tree line in the distance marks the starting point of the charge. And the fence at the midpoint of the picture, which is slightly visible, running along the middle of the picture, is the Emmitsburg Road, which was a major obstacle for Pettigrew's men. Now, as Pettigrew's men reached the rail fence which bordered the Emmitsburg Road, his assault began to bog down. He had already lost support of a Virginia brigade on his left, which had broken and retreated upon being flanked, and the heavy rails in the Emmitsburg Road fence were proving difficult to remove, especially under fire. Some units just vaulted straight over the fence, and some made a concerted effort to gather together and rush and knock the west side of the fence down. But upon knocking the west side of the fence down, they would lose much of their momentum and be unable to gather enough speed or strength to knock the east side down. So they would resort to have to remove it by hand, which also was under heavy fire. Now, Pickett's men also had to cross the Emmitsburg Road, but it was further away from the Union lines on their part of the field, so they weren't under as much rifle fire as Pettigrew's men were. Now, as I said, they were exposed to heavy musketry fire as men began to huddle in the depression of the road. It didn't offer much cover, but it was better than nothing. Pettigrew himself had been painfully wounded in the hand by shrapnel from artillery fire, and he was desperately trying to get his men to break the cover of the road and close upon the Union lines. Meanwhile, Colonel Marshall, who I neglected to mention was relatively young, he was around the same age as Bergman, in his early 20s, he was shot and killed before his brigade even reached the road. He was mounted, so he made a pretty inviting target for Union musket fire. As Pettigrew's men began to crowd the Emmitsburg Road, they made it difficult for Trimble's division, who was advancing in support, to avoid them. Many of them intermingled and crowded into the road with Pettigrew's men, but James H. Lane, who is pictured here on the right, who is a native North Carolinian, he succeeded to division command when Trimble lost his leg to artillery fire. Now, he was noticing all this crowding in the road, so he led his two brigades to the left in an attempt to bypass the traffic jam in the road. But his men also encountered the same problem as Pettigrew's men, and they also ran up against the heavy fence rails, in addition to Union soldiers who had started to flank Pettigrew's position. Now, this is a sketch that is actually in the possession of the North Carolina State Archives. It is by Chaplain Henry S. Stevens, who was a member of the 14th Connecticut, which is interesting to note. That's a northern unit, so it's interesting that we have it in our possession. He made a thorough study of the ground after the advance and meticulously marked unit positions and measured distances. The Emmitsburg Road is sketched here, and it is noted as being only 270 yards from the Union line at this point of the field, which is well within rifle range of Civil War muskets. Now, if the Union lines were going to be broken, it needed to be done soon. Everybody was crowded into the road. They were making no headway getting the fences down. The men had a fair amount of cover, but they were still being blasted by artillery and musket fire, and they were taking severe losses in their static positions. Although Pettigrew and Lane's men never made one concentrated effort to break the lines, we had many brave bands of various sizes gathered up the courage to leave the cover of the road and advance across the open ground. As you can see here, it's quite a broken formation. It's not as uniform as it was at the beginning of the advance. Many of Marshall's and Lane's Tarheels formed into these little bands and made it to within 40 or 50 yards of the Union lines before they were just blasted out of existence. Others advanced until they were pinned down and compelled by Union troops to surrender. Or one of my favorite is a Union soldier yelling to a Confederate soldier who was pinned down the other side, "Come over to this side of the Lord." That's one of my favorite quotations. Come over to this side of the Lord. Now, according to Union accounts, the closest any Confederate soldier got on this part of the line was 20 feet away from the Union lines. North Carolina veterans attempted to mark this high tide in the post-war years and eventually succeeded in having a monument erected at the spot, which is actually a few yards further than the famous high tide marker of Pickett's division. Here's the North Carolina marker, and if you look over here to the left, that's the angle, and the Virginia high tide marker is also over here to the left. But as I said, just because North Carolina's marker is further ahead than Virginians doesn't mean it was necessarily true. It's just it's very arbitrary positioning of these monuments. And North Carolina also had the luck to erect their monument after Virginia did, so it's easier for them to move it ahead. This photo was taken from the Union lines, and the fence in the distance is this white, lighter-colored fence. In the middle is the Emmitsburg Road. You can see how close it is to the Union lines. They were able to any of these groups that came across this field had to cross all this open land to get to the stone wall that the Union troops were defending from behind. Now, after all these heroic efforts to effect a foothold in the Union lines had failed, Pettigrew's and Lane's survivors now had to begin to make their way back to the Union lines, which is indicated once again by the trees in the distance. Now, As you can see, they still had to traverse hundreds of yards of open ground to make it back, and many were too badly injured to even attempt the trip. So that's still almost still almost a mile of open ground they had to go to return to their own lines. Some made a mad dash for safety. Others played dead and managed to sneak away at dusk. Some simply surrendered or were captured. J.A. Bush, whose reminiscence is in the possession of North Carolina State Archives, was shot 5 times during the charge, and he lay helpless between the lines throughout the afternoon until he was captured by advancing Union troops. Now, overall, Pettigrew's and Trimble's men had done no better or worse than their Virginian counterparts in the charge. Now, it is perhaps even more amazing that they were able to make it even as far as they did. Many of the men who had survived the brutal first day's fighting were once again subjected to combat as bad or worse than they had faced on the first day. 26th North Carolina, which, as Bill mentioned earlier, was an exceptionally large unit, but even by Confederate standards, let alone regimental standards, at the start of the battle, started with over 800 men, and after Pickett's charge, were reduced to only about 70 who were able to answer roll call on the third day. As Bill also said, entire companies had been completely eliminated and wiped from existence. This is in stark contrast to the men of Pickett's division, who, while still suffering heavy losses, were fresh at the start of the third day's assault. Now, some of Pickett's men even unfairly accused the North Carolinians of breaking and exposing them, although ironically enough, it was a brigade of Virginians which had broken and exposed Pettigrew's flank. But regardless of these post-war squabbles between Virginians and North Carolinians, a Virginian from Pettigrew's division probably summed it up best when he stated there was glory enough in that service for all when referring to the fateful charge at Gettysburg. Now, real quickly while I conclude, these are just some of the more interesting sources which I have found pertaining to the third day at Gettysburg. We have the Henry C. Brown papers. This includes a letter from Henry M. Talley, who was actually a Virginian, who participated in the charge. He was a member of Armistead's 14th Virginia Regiment. He was wounded and captured in the charge. The Lowry Shuford collection, which includes the J.A. Bush reminiscence that I mentioned earlier. Bush was that member of the 26th North Carolina who was wounded 5 times and captured. I also have the John B. Nethery papers, which includes a letter from Lieutenant W.H. Lucas, who is a member of the 33rd North Carolina of Lane's Brigade, and the Alfred Moore Scales papers. He was wounded on the first day of the battle and did not participate in the attack, but his brigade still made the charge, and many of his men were killed and wounded on the third day in the assault. And finally, the H.S. Stevens paper, which included the sketch that I showed you. This is unique because he is a Union chaplain and he is an eyewitness to the assault, and includes a pretty detailed sketch of the positions and description of the Union defenses.